Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves. It sits on 12% of the world's oil, 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, and yet it processes almost none of it. That is not an accident. That is a system. And today we're going to follow the money, all the way back to the men who designed it. To understand why Africa exports raw materials and imports finished goods, you have to understand that this was engineered. In 1884, 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. No African leader was invited. In 90 days, they divided an entire continent into colonial territories, drawing lines through kingdoms, cultures, and ecosystems that had existed for thousands of years. But here's what textbooks rarely ask. Who paid for it? Colonialism was not just a political project. It was a financial one. Armies needed funding. Railways needed capital. Mining infrastructure needed investors. And behind every colonial government, there were private financiers, bankers, bondholders, investment houses. Men who understood something clearly. You don't have to own a country to profit from it. You just have to control what comes out of the ground. The Rothschild family didn't build an empire with guns. They built it with credit. And their story begins not in a palace, but in a ghetto. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in the Judengasse, the Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, Germany, where Jews were legally confined, restricted from most professions, and barred from owning land. His family were Ashkenazi Jews, marked by centuries of persecution across Europe, navigating survival through the few economic doors left open to them. One of those doors was money. Mayer began not as a banker, but as a dealer in rare coins and antiques, developing a reputation for expertise that eventually brought him to the attention of German nobility. His access to Landgrave Wilhelm IX of Hesse, one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe, transformed him from a street-level trader into a court financier, managing royal fortunes and learning the mechanics of sovereign wealth from the inside. That access was the foundation. From it, he built a system, placing each of his 5 sons in a different European financial capital simultaneously: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. This wasn't coincidence. It was infrastructure, a private transnational financial network at a time when information and capital weren't moved slowly. The Rothschilds moved both faster than anyone else. Nathan Rothschild, operating from London, financed Britain's war bonds during the Napoleonic Wars. When Napoleon fell at Waterloo in 1815, it was Rothschild capital that had partly kept Britain's military machine funded. By the mid-1800s, the London branch, N&M Rothschild and Sons, was arguably the most powerful financial institution in the world, financing railways across Europe, sovereign debt across Latin America, and eventually, the British Empire's deepest reach into Africa. In 1875, when the British government wanted to buy a controlling stake in the Suez Canal, the strategic waterway connecting Europe to Asia through Egypt, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli needed £4 million. Immediately, Parliament wasn't in session. There was no time for public financing. He called Rothschild. Within 24 hours, the Rothschild Bank provided the funds. Britain gained control of the Suez Canal. Egypt, increasingly in debt, lost sovereignty over its most valuable strategic asset. But the Rothschild fingerprint in Africa goes deeper than Egypt. When British imperialist Cecil Rhodes, a man whose stated ambition was to paint the map of Africa red, needed capital to expand his mining empire in southern Africa, he turned to Rothschild financing. The London Rothschilds were among the primary backers of the British South Africa Company, the vehicle Rhodes used to colonize what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia, territories he literally named after himself. And in South Africa's diamond fields, the Rothschild connection goes directly to a company you've definitely heard of. In 1871, diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, South Africa. Within 2 decades, one man had consolidated almost the entire global diamond supply under a single company. His name was Cecil Rhodes. His company, De Beers. De Beers was not simply a mining company, it was a cartel, one of the most successful monopolies in modern economic history. At its peak in the 20th century, De Beers controlled over 80% of the world's rough diamond supply. It set prices, It controlled distribution. It held back supply to keep prices artificially high. And the famous slogan, "A diamond is forever," coined in 1947 by an American advertising agency, that was a marketing campaign designed to convince Western consumers that diamonds had intrinsic, permanent value, when in reality, De Beers was manufacturing scarcity and sentiment simultaneously. Here's the Rothschild connection. N.M. Rothschild and Sons served as the primary banker for De Beers for much of its foundational period. They underwrote Rhodes' consolidation of the diamond fields. They were embedded in the financial architecture that turned African land, African soil, into a privately held, London-controlled monopoly. For over a century, diamonds mined by African labor from African earth were priced, sold, and profited from, almost entirely by European financial interests. The wealth went to London, the dust stayed in Kimberley. Archival illustrations of Egypt under Khedive Ismail, grand boulevards in Cairo, construction of railways, Suez Canal inauguration ceremony 1869. Then, debt ledgers, European banking houses, British warships entering Alexandria Harbor, 1882. Here is where the story gets more complicated and more instructive. Because the Rothschilds did not only finance colonial conquest, they also financed African governments directly, when those governments came to them asking for help building their own nations. And what happened next is a masterclass in how financial power converts development into dependency. Khedive Ismail, the ruler of Egypt in the 1860s, had a vision. He wanted to modernize Egypt into a world-class state, and he had the ambition to match it. He commissioned railways, irrigation canals, telegraphs, schools, and the expansion of Cairo itself into a city that could rival Paris. He also oversaw the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, one of the greatest engineering projects in human history, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and reshaping global trade forever. But all of this cost money, enormous amounts of it. Ismail borrowed heavily from European banks, including Rothschild-connected institutions and British and French bondholders. At face value, these were development loans, infrastructure financing, nation-building capital. But the interest rates embedded in these agreements were punishing. Egypt was borrowing at rates that, by modern standards, would be classified as predatory. And here is what makes this particularly calculated. Egypt was not a poor country. It sat on some of the most productive agricultural land in the world, commanded the Nile, and had just completed one of the most strategically valuable waterways on the planet. It had everything that should have made it a low-risk borrower. But European creditors never allowed Egypt's natural resources, its land, its cotton, its canal, to serve as collateral that could reduce its borrowing costs. That leverage was deliberately withheld. Instead, Egypt was forced to borrow as if it had nothing, while sitting on everything. The result was interest obligations that compounded against a treasury that had no financial cushion to absorb them. And as the loans stacked, the Egyptian state began to buckle under debt it could not sustainably service. By 1875, Ismail was so cash-strapped that he was forced to sell Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal, the very project his nation had helped build. Britain, financed by Rothschild in just 24 hours, bought those shares immediately, and then things accelerated. By 1879, Egypt's debt crisis had become so severe that Britain and France pressured the Ottoman Empire to remove Ismail from power, replacing him with a more compliant ruler. By 1882, when Egyptian nationalists rose under Colonel Ahmed Arabi, resisting foreign financial control, Britain responded with warships. They bombarded Alexandria. They marched on Cairo, and they called it restoring order. Egypt, a sovereign nation that had taken loans to build, ended up under British military occupation. Not because it went to war, not because it threatened anyone, but because it couldn't pay the interest. That is not development financing. That is a financial siege, conducted with paperwork instead of cannon. And Egypt was not alone. Across Africa, rulers who sought outside capital to build railways, ports, and infrastructure found themselves trapped in the same system. The loan arrives as a partner. The interest compounds as a landlord. And when payment fails, sovereignty becomes the collateral. Development financing and extraction financing were rarely separate. They were two doors into the same room. Colonialism, as a political system, officially ended. But the financial architecture, quietly, did not. It evolved. After independence movements in the 1950s and 60s, new institutions stepped in. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, private equity firms, commodity trading houses in Geneva, London, and New York. Structural adjustment programs in the 1980s required African nations to privatize assets, reduce tariffs, and open markets as conditions for loans. On paper, reform. In practice, restriction. Governments were limited in their ability to build industries that could process their own resources. Why does this matter? The Democratic Republic of the Congo holds over 70% of the world's cobalt, essential for every lithium-ion battery. Phones, laptops, electric vehicles. The DRC exports raw cobalt. Processing happens elsewhere. Manufacturing happens elsewhere. Profits are captured elsewhere. And the DRC remains one of the poorest nations on Earth. Glencore, one of the largest commodity trading companies, operates major cobalt mines in the DRC. In 2022, it reported over $34 billion in profit. The DRC's entire GDP? Around $65 billion for 100 million people. This is not underdevelopment. This is resource architecture. Africa has everything it needs. The resources, the youth, the land, the talent. But here is the tension. Africa's transformation will not be given, and it will not be financed by the same institutions that built the extraction system. The African Continental Free Trade Area represents the largest free trade zone on Earth by number of countries. If African nations process their own cobalt, refine their own gold, cut their own diamonds, and trade with each other first, the financial calculus of empire begins to break. That's not a guarantee. That's a condition, and the condition is unity. The architects of extraction understood one thing. A continent that processes its own wealth cannot be controlled. So they built systems to prevent exactly that. The question now is simple. Will this generation build the system that replaces it?